New this morning, President Trump touts a trade deal with a major trading partner.
But I just signed the largest trade deal in history. I think maybe the largest deal in history with Japan. And that was done with Japan.
He announced this new deal with Japan. You can see stock futures this morning up a little bit before the opening bell. We'll see where it goes once the markets open at 9:30. CNN's Matt Egan is here to talk about this deal with Japan, which is a major trading partner.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And look, for weeks, it felt like all we were getting was escalation on the trade front. Now we're starting to get a string of deals, the biggest one being this U.S.-Japan deal. Let's go through some of the things that are in this. So a $500+ billion investment from Japan into the United States. We're still awaiting some of the key details on that, but a Japanese official says that this is going to be an investment into key industries like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. Japan also, according to President Trump, agreeing to open up trade with the U.S. on cars, rice, and other agriculture. Now, there's this 15% tariff the U.S. is going to charge on imports from Japan, and that tariff critically extends to cars and car parts. However, a 50% tariff still remains on steel and on aluminum. Now, just to remind you of where we are when it comes to U.S. tariffs on Japan, back in early April, the president threatened and actually briefly imposed a 24% tariff on Japan, one of America's closest allies. And in just over a week, tariffs from the U.S. on Japan were set to go up to 25%. This deal, again, says 15%. So better than the worst case that a lot of people had been worried about, but also higher than tariffs, of course, had been before the president took office. Now, Japan is a major U.S. trading partner. It's the fifth biggest source of imports into the United States. Last year alone, the U.S. imported almost $150 billion of goods from Japan. Now, as far as the market reaction, we looked at U.S. stock futures moving higher, not dramatically higher, but I should note the Dow is just a few hundred points away from its first all-time high since December. We're seeing a more emphatic reaction from Japanese markets. The Nikkei spiking more than 3%, and Japanese auto stocks that trade in the U.S., Toyota, Honda moving dramatically higher, more than 10% higher for Toyota and Honda apiece. And that's because, again, there's possibly a competitive advantage here, right? Autos that are being imported from Japan face that 15% tariff. They avoid the 25% tariff. But I should just note that one group that does not seem happy about this is the Detroit automakers. Reuters is quoting a trade group that represents GM, Ford, and Chrysler owner Stellantis, and they're saying that any trade deal that charges a lower tariff for Japanese imports with very little U.S. content than what's being charged on North American imports would be a bad deal for U.S. industry and for U.S. auto workers.
That's really interesting. So 15% is quite high, but it's lower than the 25% that they were charging Japan, and it's lower than the 25% or so on parts and things coming from Canada and Mexico in so-called American-made cars.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything's become so kind of turned upside down in the last few months during this trade war that we've kind of become numb to some of these numbers. But now it's all about how tariffs relate versus other countries. And again, the thinking right now among investors is that Japan could get a bit of a competitive advantage here.
Wow. Okay, Matt Egan, thank you for explaining that so well, an angle I hadn't thought of yet. Appreciate it. Kate.
We are following some breaking news as it relates to the Trump presidency. I want to transition your screen to give you a live look at the White House as we're learning a massive $550 billion trade deal has been reached with Japan. President Donald Trump confirming this information, adding it will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. I want to provide the latest remarks from the commander-in-chief as relates to this breaking news. I'm going to drop the banner so we can read it together. Take a look at your screen. President Donald Trump saying, quote, "We just completed a massive deal with Japan, perhaps the largest deal ever made. Japan will invest at my direction $550 billion into the United States, which will receive 90% of the profits. This deal will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. There has never been anything like it." President Donald Trump goes on to say, quote, "Perhaps most importantly, Japan will open their country to trade, including cars and trucks, rice, and certain other agricultural products and other things. Japan will pay reciprocal tariffs to the United States of 15%. This is a very exciting time for the United States of America, and especially for the fact that we will continue to always have a great relationship with the country of Japan." He concludes his statement by saying, quote, "Thank you for your attention to this matter." We know that President Trump saying Japan, as I just mentioned, will open its country to trade in things like cars, trucks, rice, and other agricultural products. Japan will also pay reciprocal tariffs of 15% to the U.S. Under this deal. While speaking at the White House Tuesday evening, President Donald Trump boasted about the deal, saying how he, quote, signed the largest trade deal in history with Japan. He said Japan's top people were at the White House and worked long and hard on a great deal for everyone. We do have more remarks that we want to share with you as it relates to this breaking news. Japan's prime minister making remarks on this trade deal, saying, quote, with the idea of prioritizing investment over tariffs, Japan and the U.S. have reached a deal that will benefit both sides. Automobile tariffs and reciprocal tariffs will be 15%. He goes on to say, quote, I sincerely thank Donald Trump and his tremendous leadership. Grateful to minister as well as those involved on both sides for their dedicated efforts. He concludes by saying, together with the president, we will build a new golden era for Japan and the U.S. Coming back stateside as we're following this breaking news, if you're just now tuning in, President Donald Trump announcing a massive trade agreement with Japan. As we know, this historic $550 billion trade deal with Japan. President Donald Trump saying, quote, never been anything like it. Of course, we'll continue to follow this developing situation right here on Live Now from Fox.
Welcome back. In just a few minutes, President Trump is set to deliver remarks unveiling his AI action plan, as well as sign executive orders aimed at accelerating AI innovation here in the U.S. It's the administration's latest push to expand AI infrastructure and investments, with the White House AI czar telling reporters, quote, it's a global competition now to lead in artificial intelligence. As the president races to cement the U.S. as the leader in AI technology, his trade team is also rushing to negotiate new trade deals before the president's August 1st tariff deadline. Yesterday, President Trump announced 2 new trade agreements with the Philippines and Japan. While speaking to congressional Republicans last night, the president touted the latest trade agreement and his own tariff strategy.
I just signed the largest trade deal in history, I think maybe the largest deal in history, with Japan. And that was done with Japan. They had their top people here, and we worked on it long and hard, and it's a great deal for everybody. We have a lot of money flowing in. The tariffs are kicked in better than anybody other than me and a few of the people in the room thought could happen.
Joining me now is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. Brian, thanks so much for being here, as always. So what more can you tell us about this trade deal with Japan? Notably, President Trump came out and talked a lot about it. We haven't heard a whole lot of details yet from Japan.
Yeah, well, as is the case with all of these so-called framework deals, we don't have any real text, any documents to look over that really detail the specificity of what was offered by the Japanese or the United States to one another. But the big top lines here are 15%. That is the effective tariff rate that Japan would face in terms of importing their goods into the United States. This would be a big deal for specifically the automotive industry when you consider that prior to this 15% around the world, all autos that were being imported into the United States were facing a 25% tariff. So with the new 15% tariff superseding what was previously a 25% tariff, that would be presumably good for companies like Honda and Toyota, which in some cases make vehicles in Japan and then export them to the United States. Although it's worth noting, those automakers do also in many cases produce domestically in the United States as well and would not face that tariff. But again, we don't have any real details on this. And this is a trade deal that does kind of add to the list of countries that the president has claimed to have signed a deal with, like, for example, the Philippines, as you mentioned, Indonesia before that, Vietnam also on that list. But of course, there's some big countries like China and also the European Union that we still need to wait for word from.
So, Brian, you've been watching this so closely. Are you anticipating there will be more trade deals before that August 1st tariff deadline? And of course, we did hear the White House signal some confidence that they might get something done with the EU.
Yeah, I think the next big one to watch would be the European Union. Japan is a major trading partner. It can't be discounted that this is probably the biggest country so far that the United States has inked a deal with. The European Union would be massive, especially given the barbs that have been traded from one another. You'll recall the threats of that 200% tariff on European wine. Now, of course, there is this chatter that there could be this 15% number that's thrown around. Again, we don't have confirmation of that. But again, it can't be understated, or it can't rather be said enough that that would be substantially higher than the current rates before this president.
All right, Brian Chung, as always, we appreciate you. Thanks for joining us.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.
U.S. President Donald Trump announcing an agreement has been made with Japan. And Janice McGregor is on that part of the story for us this morning from Washington. Janice, this is Trump's first deal with a major trading partner since he sent out those tariff letters earlier this month. So what should Canadians be taking away from this deal?
Well, let's start with the compromise they reached in terms of kind of the headline across the board tariff rate. 15% is what Japan has settled for. That is lower than the 25% threat that Donald Trump had written into his letter for Japan. The fact that it's lower, perhaps part of the reason anyway, we're seeing some relief on the part of the markets overnight. This lower rate, it's important to emphasize to everyone, is not something that the Japanese pay. It is what American consumers and American businesses will be paying on any Japanese goods imported into the U.S. It is effectively a sales tax at a time of, I have to say, considerable price inflation. And Donald Trump would have had to keep that in mind as this negotiation proceeded. It is landing higher than the 10% that was previously applied to, for example, Japanese cars and automotive parts heading into the U.S. Unlike the U.K., which got a 10% rate, the Japanese here have not agreed to a quota, a future cap on the growth of the Japanese auto industry as far as its exports into the U.S. are concerned. And the ambition of that, I think, is quite noteworthy on Japan's part. Japan has had sort of a favorable position with the U.S. in terms of its trade surplus, the trade deficit that Donald Trump focuses on, the fact that there's more Japanese imports coming into the U.S. than U.S. exports going into Japan, is something Donald Trump has portrayed as a weakness. Economists would disagree and would note that it's probably more a strong sign of the power of the American consumer. But nevertheless, that's why it's so interesting to see Donald Trump last night out there bragging about how Japanese companies are apparently, we haven't seen fine print on this, but he says they're going to be investing $550 billion into the U.S. Economy under this deal. Now, we already know there's been a deal to inject $15 billion in a takeover by the Japanese of U.S. steel for that industry. Will we see more automotive supply chain announcements follow? What is that going to mean for perhaps some pivoting of Japanese investment away from, say, Canada and into the U.S.? This has to be a cause for concern. But here is the U.S. president touting his big win last night.
Just signed the largest trade deal in history. I think maybe the largest deal in history with Japan. And that was done with Japan. They had their top people here, and we worked on it long and hard, and it's a great deal for everybody. I always say it has to be great for everybody. It's a great deal. A lot different from the deals in the past, I can tell you that.
President Trump is once again claiming victory with what he calls the biggest trade deal in U.S. history, a $550 billion agreement with Japan that includes a 15% tariff on imports and promises of massive investment and job creation. But when you actually look at what's happening, the numbers don't add up, the logic doesn't hold, and the people he claims to help are, once again, the ones paying the price, because that 15% tariff isn't coming out of Japan's pocket, it's coming out of yours. American consumers will feel the hit every time they buy a Japanese car or appliance, and while Trump brags that this is a step down from the 25% tariff he previously threatened, that's like calling yourself a firefighter for putting out a blaze you started, and the deal itself lacks any meaningful protection for American workers, no quotas, no requirements for local manufacturing, no labor standards, just vague investment promises with no oversight. And while Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda see their stocks rise, U.S. companies are left wondering how to compete under rules that favor foreign imports over domestic production. And it gets worse, because the European Union is now threatening a 30% retaliatory tariff if they're not offered similar terms, meaning this deal could spark yet another trade conflict with key allies at a time when economic cooperation should be the priority. And of course, there's no official text, no transparency, just press releases and political spin from a president desperate for a win. And while Fox News frames this as a triumph of negotiation, the facts tell a different story, one where everyday Americans are handed higher costs while corporations and campaign donors reap the benefits, because this isn't about sound trade policy, it's about headlines, tweets, and feeding the narrative that Trump is the ultimate deal maker, even when those deals are built on sand. And if this agreement really prioritized American workers, we'd see clear commitments to jobs, factories, and long-term economic resilience. Instead, we get a press conference and a promise, and that's not enough. Not when livelihoods are on the line, and not when the stakes are global. And let's be honest, this sets a dangerous precedent. If foreign governments learn that all it takes to win access to the U.S. Market is flattery and a headline number. We lose leverage, we lose control, and we weaken the very industries this administration claims to defend. So ask yourself, do you feel more economically secure after this deal? Or do you feel like you're being sold another illusion? Another empty promise packaged as greatness, because we've seen this pattern: bold claims, soft details, and no accountability. And if we don't call it out, we normalize it. So if you're tired of performative politics wrapped in red, white, and blue, drop your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you're done with the spin, share it if someone you know still believes the hype, and subscribe, because we're not here to play along with the narrative, we're here to break it down.